Good evening, everyone. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Karis Circle. Karis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Karis Books. Karis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We're really excited to welcome Prachi Gupta in conversation with Sahaj Kohli for a discussion of They Called Us Exceptional and Other Lies That Raised Us. In They Called Us Exceptional, an Indian American daughter reveals how the dangerous model minority myth fractured her family in this searingly honest memoir that manages to be at once a scalding indictment and a heartfelt love letter. That's a quote from Scott Stossel. This event is co-sponsored by our friends at Raksha. Raksha's mission is to promote a stronger and healthier South Asian community through confidential support services, education, and advocacy. Raksha works towards healing, empowerment, and justice for survivors of violence. We are always very honored to work with Raksha. So happy. I see Gori in the chat tonight. So thank you, Gori. Gori's a programming partner always. So really appreciate you being with us. So I'll introduce Sahaj first. So Sahaj Kohli is a therapist, writer, and the founder of Brown Girl Therapy, which is at Brown Girl Therapy on Instagram. It is the first and largest mental health and wellness community organization for children of immigrants. In this work, Sahaj creates resources that promote bicultural identity exploration and the destigmatization of therapy in immigrant communities. With a 6+ year career in journalism under her belt, her passion lies at the intersection of narrative storytelling and mental health advocacy. She is also a weekly advice columnist for the Washington Post and is writing a book with Penguin Life, But What Will People Say?, which is going to be published in spring 2024. And we're very lucky because we just realized that we can drop the pre-order link. So we will be doing that at the end of the show tonight. And you can go ahead and get your pre-order in. Pre-orders really do help authors. So don't be shy about that. Even though it's a ways away, we want to start hyping her book right now because, as you'll hear, it really is a good sequel to the book that we are celebrating tonight. And the woman of the hour is Prachi Gupta, who is an award-winning journalist and former senior reporter at Jezebel. She won a Writers Guild Award for her investigative essay, Stories About My Brother. Her work was featured in The Best American Magazine Writing 2021 and has appeared in The Atlantic, The Washington Post Magazine, Marie Claire, Salon, Elle, and elsewhere. She lives in New York City, and this is her first book. So welcome to you both, and welcome to everyone watching from around the world. We do have folks from all over the US and around the world watching tonight, which is always wonderful. We encourage you to ask questions at any time. It's not disruptive to put them in early. In fact, it's welcome. So if a question strikes you in mid-conversation, don't be shy. Go ahead and put it in there. We'll move it into the Q&A, and Sahaj will bring them into the conversation as she sees fit. But without further ado, welcome to you both. Thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
Having us.
I'm so excited to be in conversation with you.
Likewise. Thanks for being here.
As many people may not know, we are friends, but we have also been on this writing journey together. So first I want to ask you, how are you doing? You're both I know how difficult it was to write. I know how painful it can be to kind of exercise some of these memories and emotions that you've experienced over your life. And how are you doing?
I think that I'm doing well. It's been a wild 24 hours. It was terrifying. Publishing this book is the scariest thing that I've done, to sort of step into your full truth and not hide anything, the things that we're taught we're supposed to hide. So I go through sort of cycles of feeling excited and proud, and then feeling a lot of shame for, speaking out. And I think that's just going to be part of it. But I've already started receiving messages from people about feeling seen and heard, and it's both incredible, but also like a little heartbreaking that there are so many people in our community that feel this way and feel alone and have never been, their experiences have never been acknowledged.
Yeah.
So. really powerful to witness that. And I hope that this book and, in your book will create opportunities for more people to tell their stories.
I hope so too. And, you were still brave and courageous enough, knowing that you were feeling shame, to still share your story. And, as a therapist who works with our community, I think that's the biggest obstacle for so many of us, is feeling that shame and saying, well, I feel shame, therefore this must be wrong and I shouldn't do it. Can you share a little bit about how you were able to at least manage, maybe not eviscerate, but manage that shame, and what motivated you to kind of share this story, and what are you hoping, the world and readers will get and learn from reading your book?
Yeah. So, I guess I'll begin with sort of why I felt like I had to write this, because that's where, coming back to that, is how I sort of worked through the shame. In 2017, my brother Yash died, and we had been estranged at that point for about 2 years. And so when he died, I didn't really know I discovered all these mysteries about him, and including the fact that, I'm a feminist, and he was a men's rights activist towards, and that was what contributed to our estrangement, was our oppositional views. And after he died, I wanted to try to understand who he had become, and if there was anything that we could have done to, save him, stop him from going down this path that ultimately took his life. And in that quest resulted in the essay Stories About My Brother. And when I published that essay, like the same way that I was feeling sort of before the book came out, I was terrified. I sent, an email to my closest friends being like, I'm scared about tomorrow. Like, I'm publishing this on a feminist website. And at the time, like, talking about, I think most of us can relate to the fact that, we love people who are complicated, and people who we may not agree with politically, and also who have hurt us, and we still love them. And it's not how we live our lives. And so I was really scared about publishing this essay. And what happened instead, though, was this tremendous outpouring. And I was really shocked by, like, how many people saw themselves in me and my brother. How many sisters I heard from who were like, my brother's going down a similar path and I don't know how to reach him, but your book, your essay gave me compassion for what he might be going through, and maybe will help me figure out, like, a different way to approach him. I heard from men who were going down similar paths, and the essay changed their mind, and they decided to get help instead. I heard from immigrant parents, who said, I had no idea my kids might be experiencing these things. I'm going to start talking about mental health with them. So when I saw that, despite how scared I was, that I did this and it helped people, that gave me the courage to say, I'm going to tell my full story. And when I committed to that, that's what I kept coming back to, was the feeling of shame that to keep all this in, that was never mine. That was systems of oppression. That was patriarchy and capitalism and white supremacy and colonialism. All of these forces that we are all raised in, telling me that I do not have the right to speak up and talk about these things, because when we do that, we weaken the power of those systems over us. So I had to remind myself that this is where my shame is coming from. And, I have a really great therapist. I have really supportive friends and a community that believes in me. And I would, in moments where I felt like, I don't know if I can do this, I would go back to some of those emails and see the way that my words had helped people. And then I would actually also go back to my own journals and remember how alone I felt, and what it would mean to a younger version of me to see somebody talk openly about, about mental illness, about domestic violence, about some of the traumas that we are taught we have to hide because we have to project this image of perfection, and because we are seen as representatives for an entire culture, which is a burden that no one can bear and no one should have to bear.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I got chills when you were talking. The fact that you got feedback from people on that essay, I'm really glad to hear that that continued to be motivation for you to share the story, because I know I just finished this. For anyone looking, I have bookmarked so many pages because it's so beautifully written. And I'm just so glad that you were brave enough and had the courage to be able to share this story with us, because I know so many people here and moving forward, we didn't grow up with a resource like this. We didn't grow up, we're the same age. We always talk about how your book is going to be a book that you and I both could have benefited from if we were younger, or even, just this age, and it not having to be us of having to do that. So I just want to thank you for writing it. And you touched on this idea of having a double life, right? I mean, your whole book is about the model minority myth. It's all about this idea that we are expected to be, submissive, successful. We're supposed to look a certain way. We're supposed to act a certain way. And anything else needs to be brushed under that rug, and we need to pretend it doesn't exist or hide it really, really well. And throughout your book, you kind of talk about, you can sense this tension you have with recognizing, especially as we come to later in the book, and you have started to accept that things aren't going to change in your family, and you have to accept that there is no reconciling this double life. You just have to choose one, and you're choosing freedom and liberation and health and wellness. And that is so difficult to do, but that's something that's really common in our community, is hiding things. I grew up hiding things from my parents, and I grew up hiding things from the public world about my family, because that's just what we were taught to do.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, I guess, so just to give some like tangibles to all of that is, this double life that you're talking about, like my family embodied the quote unquote American dream. So my dad was a surgeon. My mom stayed at home and took care of me and my brother. And my brother and I were, high achieving students in college, and we graduated in the middle of the recession and both, got white collar jobs. And at that point, it was an immigrant family's dream. We had made it. And it was really at that point when I thought that we were going to, all the hard work has paid off. We're going to be able to relax and be happy now, is when my family really started falling apart. And I was working in a management consulting job and absolutely miserable. I saw how my brothers, this stress of perfection was basically made my brother severely depressed. And then at home, my dad was also, struggling. And I just realized, like, I began to question these stories, because I had followed this, this is sort of the immigrant roadmap. We're taught that if we follow this story, we're going to be happy and stable and secure in this country. And that so many immigrants, they have to believe in that and buy into that dream, because it's what justifies having to, leave your home country and start over. So there's a lot of pressure to buy into this dream, and then there's a lot of pressure to make good on it. And my family did make good on it. And my story is about why that dream was always a lie, because that dream was never about us actually, our well-being. That pressure is about extracting as much labor as possible from us. And so, yeah, we were just absolutely miserable. And I began to realize that these stories that we are, that prop up these myths are not about our well-being. They're stories that serve these more powerful institutions. And so I wanted to write a book that showed how I was raised on this story, and how I basically soured on this story, and what that did to my relationships, and what the story I was raised on did to my relationships. And then also, I think in American culture, there's a lot of talk about empowerment and reclamation, and it's seen as this, especially for, I think, women and girls, it's treated as like, oh, you're going to enter the sisterhood and you're going to be like so happy, and like, feminism is this fun, light thing in a way. And by that I mean like you're going to be welcomed into this like utopian sisterhood collective. of women. And that, my experience was that it was really lonely because of all that I had to give up to fight to be. It was like you said, it was this double life, and I had to choose one. And what do you do when you're the only one in your family system that makes that decision? And you make that decision out of self-preservation because you cannot survive the other way, and you can't pass, and you can't use that same system, you can't get any of the power that, sometimes men can get through patriarchy. Like if you're a woman, or if you're non-binary, you're not going to be allowed to work in that system. So we don't have that option. So yeah, I wanted to show how all of that worked and coalesced into a family unit.
Yeah, and I mean, you did a beautiful job of highlighting that throughout every page of your book, and I think everything you just said was also the macro of it, right? How the model minority myth is a product of the systems that we exist in, especially in the West, right? This is the whole country was rooted. When we think about immigration and historical immigration laws and whatnot, we think about our need, or our parents' need, our ancestors' need when they move here to be of service to the economy, to be of service to the larger system in which we are trying so hard to belong in. And then to your point, when we take that on a micro level, what's happening is we're really uplifting and upholding the model minority myth, even in our own families, to one another. And that's what's disallowing this intimacy that I felt that you experienced, your brother experienced, even your mom, even your dad to some degree, right? We were all kind of in parallel journeys in different ways, of course, but you were all kind of subscribing and struggling to reconcile with this model minority myth that was harming the way that you were even able to feel intimacy with one another.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I want to answer the question that's in the chat right now, because I think this is a really good question, a really good point to make. The question is there anything you'd like to offer for the tons of Desi international students coming with these dreams? And obviously, this is an experience I cannot speak to specifically, as it's not my own. And what I would say is, I would like to clarify that there's nothing wrong or damaging about having hopes of being stable and successful. I think, we all want that. I think the problem comes in when we let that define our worth, and we let these external systems tell us whether we have value or not as people. And I think capitalism and American society really trains us to see ourselves in these terms, where we are what salary we make, we are what our job title is, we are what we produce, and none of us are that. And I think that for immigrants are more vulnerable and more susceptible because they literally, you are reliant on a visa in a country deciding whether or not you're going to be allowed. So it's really easy, I would imagine, to feel as if this is where your value lies, but it doesn't. This is a system. And it's not a good system. It's not a fair system, and it will never give you, that worth has to come from somewhere else. And that sense of value and purpose has to come from somewhere else, and it can't come from, a job status, for example.
Mm-hmm. I love that answer, because also something in your book that really resonated with me was this idea of, for many of us who are either immigrants or children of immigrants who are in this country, and we come from collectivist cultures, and we're trying to make it, we're trying to be successful, we're trying to achieve these dreams. Many of us are struggling with how to even take care of ourselves, right? So even the concept of wellness, of self-care, there's one part in your book where you talk about, there's too much me or I in the sentence when you were talking to, I think, one of your therapists, and just finally realizing, oh, I have to factor myself into this. I don't want to abandon myself for the sake of what is supposed to be family or love or culture when it's dysfunctional or unhealthy or abusive or traumatic. So yeah, can you speak to that a little bit, of just figuring out how to factor yourself in while also maintaining relationships or choosing not to?
So for me, a really big barrier to, this idea of self-care was that I think a lot of people can relate to this. In my household, there was a really strong binary between American, your outside life and your inside life. And your inside life, for me, that was Indian. So if your inside life is Indian and your outside life is American. And so we have this like split sense of identity, but then there was also like, there were some contexts in which it was good to be American. And by that, I mean like trying to assimilate into white America. But then there were contexts in which being American was bad. And like, and it was almost a slur. And it was like a betrayal of your own culture. And I had the hardest time trying, for so long, I saw the world in that binary because it was pushed on me. And so that blocked me from real meaningful self-care or even knowing what that could mean, because I just dismissed it all as like, oh, that's for white people. That's American. That's not for people like us. And the reason that we can maintain the culture that we do, that gets so far ahead, is because we are this, you know, this family unit, this impenetrable unit. And these are stories that are not serving us, and they're not even based in reality. They're not true. But because I was so isolated, and I didn't really have access to a larger community that where we felt safe talking about these things, I accepted that as my truth. And I think that kind of confusion is really common. Mm-hmm. I think it stems from the larger issue there is that when you have a dominant culture, and I think a diasporic culture, and the dominant culture has these narratives about who you are or who you're supposed to be in order to fit in and really be safe, that can define what that culture has to become, and it puts you on the defensive, because culture is not a static thing. Mm-hmm. But in these diasporic communities, it can turn into that if we're constantly trying to defend ourselves from dominant narratives about who we are. And that's a distraction, because then we can't actually deal with the problems within our culture, because we're always trying to defend it or act like there aren't any problems, because we're scared of our status with the dominant culture.
For sure. And it's like you write, and you've talked about openly about, and we've talked about this when we talk about writing our books, this idea of wanting to highlight the reality of the harsh reality and sometimes the really ugly reality of what our experiences are or what are cultural norms, while also being really mindful of what is a stereotype and what is, appeasing maybe this Western view of our culture and our community.
Yeah. So the two ways, I was so cognizant of this, like, a white writer is never going to, be seen as representing their entire race or culture. Right. But that falls on so many of us. And I think we live with that burden and that pressure. And instead of giving that idea, so what I wanted to do with the book was sort of like turn that idea on its head and acknowledge the expectation that exists, and show how that expectation has affected my psyche and my relationships and my entire family's relationships with each other. And so I wanted to show how that makes us feel. So I think that
You do a good job of doing that, of talking about it, especially because the letters are written, this is not a spoiler alert for anyone, but it's written to your mom, right? The whole book is written to your mom. And so you are really telling us your story as if you were talking to your mom and saying, hey, because I think it's like, I have it bookmarked on page 12. So really early on in the book, you already acknowledge, as you're writing to your mom, that you guys are on opposite sides of the story, that you already acknowledge that your story is very different from hers. Your story is going to be different from every one of your family members, everyone else who identifies as South Asian, right? We are a product of our culture, but we also have very different experiences in our own families and about our own culture and within our own culture and community. And so I love that you do that, because I think a part of that is for you to also reclaim your story, right? I think one of the themes I really took from this book as a narrative therapist, I practice as a narrative therapist, is you saying, this is a story we've been sold, and this is me now, confronting it and interrogating it, and also reclaiming my story as reality and not questioning it anymore and owning it as something that is a lived part of you. But now you can also author and decide where's the next page going to go.
Yeah. And one of the reasons I wanted to write this as a letter to my mom, I mean, that came from a really genuine place. Like, after my brother died, I really wanted to reconnect with my mom. And I didn't know how to do that. And I didn't want her to die or me to die without the chance to share with her who I really am and explain to her why I made the choices that I made, and to show her that even though we have this distance between us, that is not an indication or a reflection of the amount of love that I have for her. And I needed her to hear that from me, but I didn't know how to just say it. So I had to write this book. And I wanted to show her through these stories, that the stories that we were told and how these stories kept us basically apart, or pushed us apart. And yeah, so and sorry, there's like another question about that in the comments about challenges between like the AC generations to talk honestly about things, given how much concern there is among the elders about what people will say. I almost feel like you should answer that first, since you're writing a book on that.
Well, my book is called "But What Will People Say?" So, I mean, I'm curious to hear your thoughts, but I think for me, I come from it from a very clinical perspective, given that I've, studied this and I've tried really hard to challenge the wellness narratives and norms we're taught in a Western standpoint, especially having been trained from a Western perspective and Eurocentric perspective. I'm very aware that the things that I have been taught and the tools I've been taught to use with clients are not culturally sensitive for a lot of us. They don't really represent this specific question of us saying, well, how do we actually talk about it when my parents don't want to hear it? And I think it really goes back to your point where that black and white mentality, that binary that we are all taught is kind of rooted, and I would love to hear your perspective, but from what I've seen is really rooted in survival mode. And our parents are in survival mode. Our ancestors were in survival mode, right? My grandparents were refugees. My parents were immigrants. And now here I am in the West with opportunities and resources, able to kind of emotionally self-actualize in ways no one in my family has been able to do. And that's going to lead me to kind of, in some ways, surpass my family when it comes to emotional awareness and acknowledging these things that are really difficult. So talking about it with parents can be really hard because they're kind of stuck. They're stuck in that survival mode. Well, I need to have control. I need to figure it out. And I'm curious, I mean, what are some of the challenges? Like, you talk about the roles your family played, you talk about gender, you talk about all of these things that really fed into that. Well, we really care about what other people are going to think. How do we confront that?
And it's so hard because at the end of the day, there are two realities, right? Like there's the reality that like there is this generational trauma and these very real reasons why, our parents are the way they are, for example. But then there's also our realities of the fact that some of that behavior can be very hurtful, and one doesn't cancel the other out. You can have empathy, you can understand, you can have compassion, but you also have to protect yourself. And then I think there's a lot of guilt and shame, at least for me, there's a lot of guilt and shame with acting on that, because I also felt this generational weight of like, I had this privilege that none of my ancestors had. And what does it mean to have that privilege when I'm born in the country that we're not even from? And I felt so much shame over that. And I think that's something I think I still work through and try to navigate. But one of the survival mechanisms that you were talking about that came up in the book a lot was this idea of forgetting. So I talked to, for the book, I interviewed several of my family members, including my grandfather. And we had conversations about incidences in the past that he had never told me about. And, and he died over the winter. So this was just like a year before his death. And he was very candid with me. He shared everything. And he was scared about how this would, make the family look, but he also, to his credit, believed that it was important, and he supported the effort and he supported the book. But I asked him, I was like, Dadaji, did you ever think that like what would happen if you just, dismissed this or forgot that this happened? Like, for example, some of my dad's behavior and treatment of me or my mom, and, these were patterns that would repeat over and over again. And my grandfather, and I was like, I was like, "Do you think that forgetting is really the best thing?" And he was like, "I mean, what else could be better?" And I said, "Well, if we forget, then we're enabling the conditions, we're recreating the conditions for the same bad thing to happen again." And he said, "You know, no, I think forgetting is the best. It's still the best thing." And it was just how he had survived
Mm.
the trauma of his childhood, of moving to a new country, and all of the things that he had suppressed, affected how he parented my dad, and was seen with my grandmother. And then they passed that down to me. And I'm the first person in my family who's been stable and secure enough and not stuck in survival mode where I can be like, hey, this is actually some of this is really hurting us, and stop and take a look at what that is and why. But again, doing that can come at such a great cost, and it can be really lonely.
For sure, and it kind of feeds itself, right? Like, they don't therefore they have coping skills that are either conscious or not,
Yeah,
whether it's denial, forgetting, like, the ways that they react to their own trauma triggers, again, consciously or not, they have these behaviors and then they feed into this kind of denial that then feeds into recreating the same trauma that we're trying to break,
exactly.
which then feeds into the kind of hurtful and harmful coping skills, and it kind of all feeds itself over and over again.
And I found that sort of these patterns that replicate, this is what is often used to create these tropes or stereotypes. So
Mhm.
this is one of the things that contributes to the idea of like the tiger parent or the like good Indian daughter mold. And I always saw the tropes, and they, because they happened to match with my family, I felt so much shame over like, am I just a stereotype? Like, where is my actual lived experience in all of this? But now understanding how these cycles happen and how these tropes are used to sort of evade accountability over behavior. It's not as if any of this is inherently tied to identity. It's not. It's just it's about trauma and what we pass down and how we deal with it or how we don't.
Exactly. I did some of my clinical training at a family clinic, and one of the things that one of my supervisors had once said that really resonated with me, and I still use to this day with some of my clients, is this idea of like pulling at like an issue, right? So one issue is usually a product of another issue, which is a product of another issue, which is a product of another issue. So like you're just like pulling and pulling and pulling until you can get to that root issue.
Mm.
But something that often happens when you are the person, so a theme in your book is that you were the problem, right? You have your mom and your brother sometimes saying, your dad is just like this with you, that it's you. There's something you do to make him this way, which I is probably an incredibly painful thing to hear over and over again by people you really respect and love about someone whose love you desperately are aching for.
Yeah.
But you still had the fortitude and strength to say, I'm going to pull a little bit. It was almost like, imagine a sweater and you pull the string, the whole sweater like fell apart because you just decided to pull it. And that's really what breaking generational cycles and breaking generational trauma is. It's like pulling at it and saying, maybe this does need to all fall apart in order for it to be rebuilt in a way that is healthier and that, feels better for all of us.
Yeah. I think one thing that really helped me do that was that I could just never, and made it harder for my brother to do that, was that I could just never fit the mold of what was expected of me. I tried, but I was, this artsy kid, athletic kid who wanted to be an athlete, run cross country for school, like college. I wanted to be a writer and a painter. I just, and the mold was so narrow in our communities, in many immigrant communities, that like that doesn't even sound like that, like out there, but it was for me, and I think it was for many of us in our generation, and then also as a woman, it's just that like I could never fit the social roles. So like from a very early age, I felt this resistance of like I wasn't even trying to rebel. There was just something innately about me that like wasn't okay. And I think my brother got messaging that if he, he fit the mold or the expectations a lot better, just more naturally. He was just talented in the sciences in a way that I never was. And I think that actually that made it harder for him to separate who he really was, like his persona, his like identity from his persona, the image he was expected to portray. There were similarities there that made it harder for him to untangle. Whereas with me, I was just like so far off from those expectations that it was a lot easier to not keep them separate, because I had trouble with that too in my household, because being isolated based on, in white America. But it was easier to untangle as I got older, because I knew that I was just never going to fit into this mold. And then I could question, well, why is that? You know? And that's really, it was really when I had the space to distance myself a little bit from the family system, I began to ask a lot of questions, and my questions went to more and more questions.
Yeah. Do you think that mold, I know the answer to this given reading your book, but do you think that mold looked different for you and your brother based on gender or age or birth order, or, some of the cultural norms that we have about sons versus daughters and the expectations that are there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it did. Like my brother and we were so close. Like he was 18 months younger than me, and he was my best friend. And so those differences really didn't exist in our world. Like we didn't see each other like that, like through the lens of gender. He was just my best friend. But I think the world had created so, and culture and even American society created these roles for us based on, biological sex, based on what, a very narrow idea of what Indian culture is supposed to be, or Indian American culture is supposed to be. And these things that we absorbed through family, through society, did slowly teach us who we have to be in order to be accepted. And the pressures on us were different. Like I think he felt very much that he had to be a provider. And I think he also felt like really emasculated as a South Asian guy in white America. And that was a pressure that I did not appreciate or understand until after he died. And I went back trying to understand, because I think we both had a lot of anger, and I just sort of dismissed that as like kind of silly, because you're a guy, you have so much more status in society. But I didn't appreciate the way that racism breeds patriarchal attitudes, that white supremacy racializes, applies basically gender roles in a way to race as well. So yeah, I didn't appreciate the pressure that put on him.
Yeah. And so it sounds like maybe your parents, to some degree, had the same expectations when it came to achievement and success, but there were narratives that were being internalized by systems that are rooted in patriarchy, right? We're all kind of a product of patriarchal systems over and over again, however many times over, given the countries we're from.
Right.
But those, and that goes back to the point of your book, which is this model minority myth and the stories that we are told about ourselves, but also told that we're supposed to stay in, like the narrative we're supposed to just uphold, and how problematic that can be. It's almost like being told, like, here's a box that's the shape of a square, now you need to fit in this, when you're like, I'm a circle. I don't fit into this. Like, this doesn't exist who I am.
And like that's like mental health, I think, is so pathologized. Like we're taught to think of it as, at least the way I thought of it growing up was like, oh, you're, like a malfunctioning machine, and then you're going sent back to the like factory, like to be reset. Like that's how I thought about mental health. And there was so much shame in that idea, because I was already told as a brown person, as a, like there are things that are wrong with you, that you're not enough as it is. So then to have this one other thing, like, oh, this is also wrong with me. So there is a lot of shame in the idea of mental illness that prevented us from addressing this. But now what I understand is that, when we're functioning in a system that really only values our labor or our productivity, and doesn't really want to see your full personhood, of course it's going to affect your mental health. Like, you have to adapt to a system that doesn't want all of you, and that's going to cause problems. And then on top of that, as immigration is traumatic and demands a type of forgetting for people, and then we also have on top of that trauma from ancestors, like, that they had to deal with, that gets passed on in terms of patterns and how we talk about things, or most likely don't talk about things. So these things are very normal and common. But I think when therapy started being helpful for me was when I started seeing a therapist who shared in my identity and didn't treat any of these issues as contradictions and didn't pathologize me. It was like, yeah, that's normal. Like, of course, like that. And the confusion was normal. And one of the things I really wanted to do with the book was articulate this confusion and show that this is a valid and normal part of the experience, of my experience.
Yeah. And I know you're not alone. I mean, I hear from people in the Brown Girl therapy community and clients I work with who come to me as, fully formed adults who are like, I don't know why I'm struggling with this one thing. And it's like, of course you are, because you are trying to convince yourself it's not real, or it's, you're supposed to just accept it, when in reality, that's just something that you've been taught systemically and from your family, in some cases. And it makes sense that it doesn't feel good to you.
Yeah.
Talking about this confusion, makes me want to explore a little bit with you. I know we have 15 minutes left, but this confusion around race and culture as well, that's a big theme in your book. And in the context of, you share a lot about how you showed up at work, or this idea of being Indian American and, your white friends, or just culturally, you said it earlier today in this conversation about feeling like, inside you are Indian, outside you are American, and really reconciling with that. Because as you said, and as I know, and as I try to do with my own clients when they come to me for cultural confusion, culture's not static, right? We are learning to blend different cultures. We all are navigating multiple cultural streams all the time. It doesn't matter how you identify, because our workplaces have cultures, because our family has cultures, because there's macro cultures, because there's, the cultures within our relationships. There's what we perceive as healthy and good for us. It all looks different for all of us. And so I guess I'm curious, you're very open about having gone to therapy and done this work. Where are you now on this journey when it comes to like racial anxiety and cultural anxiety? At least for me, I think it's going to be a lifelong journey for many of us, navigating that. But as you reflect on what you've shared in the book and how you're feeling, where are you with all of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that for a long time I felt really insecure about my cultural identity. Like, I wasn't Indian enough. I didn't know even the idea of like being Indian, like, what does that really mean? Like, India was a colonial, British India. Like, before the British came in, there was no India. We had South Asia, and it wasn't even called South Asia. Even that term, it comes from that kind of background. But I think that in the past, my culture was sort of a performance because I didn't feel comfortable just being me. And I was always monitoring myself as to like, is this the Indian part of me? Is this American? Like, I felt this divide, and I wanted to identify with being Indian, but I didn't really know what it meant beyond like eating this food or wearing these clothes. And it was and I could feel that it was sort of this shallow interaction with being Indian, but it also, these things spoke to me, and I felt a lot of shame that I didn't know more, that I didn't have a stronger relationship, and that I desperately wanted, but didn't know how to deepen. And then at the same time, feeling the shame and the conflict of like, there's so much that I see in my home life or in this immediate community that that isn't accepting of all of me. And so can I even get along with it? Like, and what does that say about my ability, like, to even be Indian? And now I know that all of that is sort of that it is the ways in which we are all of these pressures that we're talking about, these forces of colonization, of white supremacy, and also like in India with caste and class and the way that we have stratified society to create very narrow roles of who people are supposed to be, and how that shapes what Indian American society is here. So when I began to, I worked a lot with my therapist on all of these issues, and she actually was like, you should go back and look at, read some history and learn about, you are not anomalous to your culture. We have a rich history of arts, of feminism, of, all of these things. And then I began to wonder, why was it so hard for me to find these narratives? Why was there this one narrow narrative of who I was supposed to be? And where did that come from? And what does that serve? And that is an inquiry that I follow throughout the book, and use research and, from post-colonial theory, from feminists, from Marxist history, to show how these narratives that we adopted as our own in this country are not our own, and they are not used to serve us. They serve these institutions that want to extract labor from us. And then, slowly I sort of rewrote through understanding the deeper histories that have been buried. I also began to feel pride in my identity and a deep connection to culture that came from something almost ancestral, like that this has always been me, and I'm coming home to it, and I'm reclaiming this with my story in my own terms. And so that's where I am now, where I'm still learning so much. I mean, instead of orienting myself, I think as an Indian American, I honestly, like, many times oriented myself through whiteness. Mm-hmm. And it's orienting myself through, like, my relationship with South Asian diaspora has been a huge journey, and I'm still learning with about the privilege that I have as an Indian American in that context. And I'm going to keep learning, and it's a lifelong journey of decolonizing. But I feel proud of our cultures now, and there are problems that we have to deal with. And I think that, I'm so much farther than I was. And I hope that these are real issues, though, like the confusion and the shame that we're made to feel prevents us from being able to really be in community with each other to talk about our culture and what it can be and what it has been.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I mean, I feel that, and I resonate with everything you said, because it's something I've had to explore myself, right? Being older, in my 30s, and feeling like, oh, I am just in these past decade reconnecting with parts of my history, parts of my culture. There's almost a level of shame of feeling, why haven't I always felt connected to it? But we have to remind ourselves that it is a product of larger narratives that we've kind of been upholding, either subconsciously or not. And given the acculturation issues, the immigration history in our family, I know people in the community who come from countries that no longer exist, or because of colonization, because of war, because of genocide, because of all of these experiences. And so I really resonate with that. And I think so many people listening will also resonate with the fact that culture is always evolving. Our cultural identity is fluid, right? It's never too late to connect with your culture. You're not the only one who is trying to connect with your culture. There are people who are also on this journey. But I think it can be really easy to feel that shame. And I think what I've noticed in the community, especially in the South Asian one, not just for children of immigrants, but even more specifically, is this level of like, you should already know everything, and you should be able to represent your community, or you should turn your back completely on it. Like, people kind of feel like, again, we subscribe to this binary mindset of like, I either know everything or I'm not good enough. Where in reality, we all land somewhere in the middle where we're figuring things out.
Yeah. And again, some of that is also the pressure that the model minority myth puts on us to like get it all right. And the truth is that there is no right. There's no right way to be, Indian or whatever ethnicity. Like that's not that's
Yeah.
a real thing. That's not how culture works. There's a question that asks, did you not experience the sisterhood and community you were expecting? And I want to address that because I think that when I was talking about sisterhood and community, what I was referring to was, so I do have community now, and and I do have sisterhood now. And I think, and it's so important to me. But it's not I think that many of us in mainstream society are sold this sort of idea of what sisterhood and community means, that is very, honestly, it's like rooted in sort of this white feminist idea of sisterhood and community, where it's not what I consider community now, which, like, community now is built on sort of mutual support and aid, and it can tolerate differences in ideas and opinions, and it's built on this, these solidarities, which is sort of this very intersectional framework. But I think there's this portrayal of sisterhood, and certainly this image that I wanted of just like almost this utopia of just like positivity, and you'll just be like, people like, I don't even know how to describe exactly what it is. Do you know what I'm talking about? Like, is that making any sense?
It does. It does make sense.
The image that I have of, it's almost like the Barbie. I mean, I haven't seen the movie, so I'm not the movie right now, but just like,
but yeah,
fake idea.
No, it makes sense. It makes sense to me. And I like that you use the word intersectional, because I think that is really important, especially in the context of the model minority myth and us, having intersectional allyship between marginalized communities and being in community with each other, and, not making it ever feel, which again is a product of white supremacy and colonialism and colonization, is this idea that we are kind of pitted against each other, and the model minority myth upholds that. And what you're doing with your book, I think, is starting those conversations around, we need to address this on a macro level, we need to address this in our own families, and then we need to address this as communities, right? Yeah. How is this actually hurting us as community? So yes, when you talk about experiencing community, I think, if correct me if I'm wrong, but what you're saying is having that intersectional allyship between different people. We don't all need to look the same. We don't all need to have the same experiences, but coming together in solidarity, like you said.
Yes. And I think what I was referring to when I said this idea of a community or sisterhood that I was sold, was this like image that, of like women who sort of all look the same and talk the same. And there's not really a tolerance, or even a tolerance for differences. And also they don't suffer. They don't talk about suffering. They don't have hardships. Like, it's this Hollywood idea and portrayal, honestly, of what we're sold as sisterhood. It's like that sort of image of like, you'll see, I've seen so many TV shows like this in the pandemic of just like the problems that it'll be like a show about like 3 women, and like their problems are not deep, like they're like
no depth or nuance to them.
Yeah, there's no nuance, and they don't get into the kind of conflicts that like people in real life really get into with people they love. Like, everyone that they love, like there might be something hard that happens, but they resolve it and they're fine and they get back, because that's sisterhood, and that's just not real life, and that's not how communities work.
Yeah. For everyone who is listening, we might have time for 1 or 2 more questions, but Prachi, I have a final question for you. Just given all the work that you've done and all the work that you have obviously put into healing, and it's not, healing's not a destination for everyone listening. It's part of the process, and you've done a lot of that work, and that, this book is very much a product of the healing work that you have done so far. I'm curious, and I think this will resonate with a lot of people. What do you want to say to younger Prachi, who's in the thick of it, who is still learning language about trauma and mental health and mental illness, and, who may still be at the very beginning of her journey of learning about the model minority myth and the expectations placed on you? When you look back at younger you, given how far you've come, what's something that you want to say to her?
Just that you should, I honestly, I don't even know, like, she was right. Like, she knew so much more than she gave herself credit for. And she has guided me to where I am today. It was that same fire, those desires, that artist, that person who wanted to express. I'm so thankful for her that she never gave up on art, on hope, on imagining. Never let that imagination go. And I would tell her, like, well, I'm thankful for her. And also, like, I think that when we lose, so many of these systems are designed to break our capacity to imagine. And we cannot create the better conditions or the better world that we want for ourselves and that we deserve when we lose the capacity to imagine. And so I am so grateful that she hung on to that, because that I couldn't have imagined writing this book or being where I am now. But it was because of that never died that I got to where I am now.
Yes, I love that so much. There was something in you that pushed you to keep going and to listen, even when it was really maybe muted, the voice within you, or really hard to find, or muddled by other people's voices, like your dad's or anyone else who was in your life kind of speaking for you. But you never gave up and you never stopped kind of taking that next step. And I think that's really important and something that's really powerful for a lot of people here to take away, this idea of just trusting yourself. And for many of us, especially in the Indian community, we haven't really been taught, self-trust. Instead, we're taught other people might know better. And for you, in your case, even if you didn't know it, there was a little level of that self-trust. And I think that's really amazing.
Thank you. Yes, that self-trust is a big issue. And I think even the idea of what is the self to trust, I was like, myself was triangulated from so many different, like, I thought that who I was the ability to be a mirror to other people and what they needed me to be. I really thought that that was what made me me. And so how do we go from that space to trusting ourselves when we live in a world that makes us question our experiences, not just within our family systems, but through racism and patriarchy, constantly telling us that what we experience isn't what we are experiencing. So I think that there's a real issue we face with learning how to trust ourselves. And it's really hard, but, I think the stories that we tell influence that, and we can all learn how to do that for ourselves.
Definitely. I 100% agree. And I'm so grateful to have been in this conversation with you, and I can't wait for the world to read this. I'm so lucky that I was already able to get my hands on a copy and be able to read this and highlight it and share it with people. Tell us a little bit about how you can buy this book. And if you haven't already picked it up, you definitely should. Prachi, thank you so much for everything in this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you both so much. This is a beautiful conversation. Yes, please click this teal button at the bottom center of your screen to buy They Called Us Exceptional and Other Lies That Raised Us from Karis. Really does help us when you buy your event books directly from us. So thank you for doing that. You can also pre-order But What Will People Say, which is available there in the chat. I realized I just didn't put a space, so I will repost it in the chat so that you can actually click that link in just one moment. But we would love for you to pre-order that as well. As always, it helps authors when you request books be carried by your local public library. So please consider doing that as well. In digital version and in paper version. Let the librarians know that you would like to have it. It's very easy to request, and it helps overall, and helps make sure that other folks who can't afford to buy a book can have access to this important information and these conversations. So also, if you have friends who should have been here tonight and would love to watch this, just know that it's going to be put up on our YouTube channel in just a few days, and you can share the conversation freely with folks who should be here, and hopefully that will encourage them to want to buy the book and keep the good word going. So thank you again to both of you, and thanks to everyone watching at home. We really appreciate you, and we look forward to future conversations. So have a great night. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye, Prachi.
Bye.